Chapter 1. The Sasnach's arrival, the wind howling down from the peaks of the Sutherland Mountains, sounded less like weather and more like a disgruntled ghost with a grudge. It whipped the rain into a fine, stinging spray that turned the streets of Lockdove into a treacherous slick of grey slate. Inside the tiny police station, PC Hamish Macbeth was engaged in his most important task of the day, attempting to coax a decent cup of coffee out of an ancient, temperamental kettle that seemed to share his own low opinion of work. Hamish, lanky and seemingly held together by little more than a dishevelled uniform and a stubborn refusal to be useful, leaned against the radiator. His red hair was a chaotic thicket that appeared to have been styled by a gale, and his eyes, hazel and sharp, were currently fixed on a spider navigating the crack in the ceiling, with more ambition than Hamish possessed. Lugs, his mongrel dog, was curled into a tight, damp ball beneath the desk, occasionally letting out a low, mournful sigh that perfectly summarized Hamish's feelings about the morning. He was desperately hoping to avoid the ringing telephone. Headquarters in Strathbane had a nasty habit of calling on Tuesdays to inquire about proactive policing, a concept Hamish found to be a blight on the natural order of life in the Highlands. If he wasn't there to answer, he couldn't be burdened with the paperwork. It was a simple, elegant philosophy that had served him well for years. The peace of his planned stagnation was shattered by the distinct, aggressive roar of a high-performance engine echoing off the nearby mountains, followed by the screech of tires on wet stone. Hamish groaned, a sound that started deep in his belly and rattled his very teeth. "Someone's in a hurry to be disappointed, Lugs," he muttered, reaching for his peaked cap with a reluctance that bordered on physical pain. He shuffled out the door, his boots dragging against the wet gravel. At the edge of the village, near the narrow, winding track that led up to the long-abandoned Raven Hill Cottage, sat a gleaming, midnight blue sports car that looked like it had been dropped from a space station. Standing beside it, looking like a man who had personally insulted the weather and expected it to apologize, was a stranger. He wore a coat that cost more than Hamish's entire annual salary, and a scarf that looked far too delicate for the Highlands. The man caught sight of Hamish and marched forward, his face a caricature of impatient, well-bred arrogance. "You, Constable, I've been trying to find someone for an hour. Do you have any idea how difficult it is to navigate these archaic, one-track disasters you call roads?" Hamish stopped, leaning back on his heels, his mouth falling open in a display of slow, blinking confusion. "Morning to you too, sir. Grand day for a drive, isn't it? The roads are a bit tight, but they've been that way since the Romans left." "Are you lost?" "I am not lost," the man snapped, his voice tight with disdain. "My name is Julian Thorne. I have purchased Raven Hill Cottage. It was a whim, really a rustic retreat for my writing. Though, looking at the state of this place, I suspect I've made a tactical error in judgment. I require someone to haul the local refuse and overgrown vegetation away from the property immediately, and I expect the local police to provide a security patrol, given the isolation." Hamish scratched his head, his face a picture of slack-jawed wonder. "Raven Hill. Och, that's a bit of a place. That been empty for 20 years. Roof's a bit light on tiles, and the locals have a bit of a story about it. Say the wind there sings in a way that's meant to warn you off." Thorne scoffed. A sharp, dismissive sound. "Superstitions. How charmingly primitive. I don't mind the wind, Constable. I care about getting this property modernized before the winter sets in. I want the site cleared, and I want it done by tomorrow." Hamish watched him with a gaze that remained deceptively dull, but his mind was already cataloguing the man's vanity, the frantic energy beneath the arrogance, and the way his hands trembled slightly as he checked his expensive wristwatch. Thorne wasn't just a man who wanted a cottage, he was a man running from something, and he had chosen the most desolate, isolated corner of the Highlands to hide. "I'll see what I can do, Mr. Thorne," Hamish drawled, his Highland accent suddenly thick as treacle. "But things move a bit slow up here. The mountains, they take their time." "Well, make them hurry," Thorne barked, turning back to his car. Hamish watched him drive off, the blue paintwork flashing against the grey, oppressive sky. He turned to Lugs, who was sniffing the damp air, with an expression of profound disapproval. "He's not going to like that cottage, Lugs," Hamish whispered, his voice losing its drawl and becoming as sharp as the mountain air. "And I have a terrible feeling that Raven Hill is about to become a place where people don't just come to write. The wind up there, it doesn't just sing, it screams." He pulled his cap low, feeling the heavy, cold pressure of the damp, and began the long, slow trudge back toward the station. His quiet Tuesday was officially over, and the dark, inevitable tide of a murder was beginning to creep into the borders of his beloved, peaceful Lockdown. Chapter 2. Silence at the summit the following morning was not a morning at all, but a thick, suffocating wall of fog that had rolled down from the moors during the night, effectively erasing the world beyond the village street. Hamish Macbeth was in a state of profound, meditative contentment. He was slouched in his battered office chair, his feet resting on the iron grate of the stove, while a single, perfect piece of toast blackened slowly on the top. He had successfully ignored the telephone 3 times, and his conscience was currently resting as easy as his feet. The peace was shattered by a frantic, high-pitched ringing of the station doorbell, followed immediately by the desperate pounding of a fist against the wood. Hamish groaned, a sound that started somewhere in the depths of his soul and ended with the reluctant straightening of his lanky spine. Lugs, who had been enjoying a deep, whistling sleep, gave a single, irritated woof and retreated beneath the desk. Hamish shuffled to the door and pulled it open, fully expecting a complaint about sheep or a missing garden gnome. Instead, he was met by the sight of Julian Thorne's driver, a young man named Greg, who looked as if he had just witnessed an apocalypse. His face was the color of day-old porridge, and his hands were shaking so violently that he couldn't seem to find the handle of the door. "He's dead," Greg whispered, his voice cracking. "The master. He's dead, Hamish, up at the cottage." Hamish didn't jump. He didn't issue a flurry of commands. He stood there, the cool, damp air curling around his shoulders, and let out a long, slow breath. His internal world, usually a landscape of mild apathy, suddenly shifted into a state of hyper-alertness. He looked at the driver, his hazel eyes losing their habitual, performative cloudiness. "Right," Hamish said, his voice dropping into a register that was calm, authoritative, and entirely unlazy. "Take a breath, Greg. Tell me what you found." "I went up to deliver his mail and check the generator," Greg stammered, leaning against the doorframe. The front door was wide open, swaying in the wind. "I went inside. The main room was a mess, like a tornado had hit it. And Julian, he was in the writing nook. He's been struck, I think. There's a heavy brass fireplace poker on the floor, and he's just sitting there, but he's not breathing." Hamish didn't wait for more. He grabbed his coat, whistled for Lugs, and headed toward the Land Rover. The drive up the narrow, tortuous path to Raven Hill Cottage was a grueling affair. The mist was so thick, it was like driving through a bowl of curdled milk. The tires spun on the slick, rain-soaked mud. When they finally reached the summit, the cottage loomed out of the fog like a jagged, broken tooth. The interior was a scene of calculated, violent chaos. Books had been ripped from the shelves, their pages torn and scattered like dying birds, and the heavy oak desk was splintered. But the center of the tragedy was the writing nook, a small, circular room overlooking the sheer drop of the cliffs. Julian Thorne was seated in his leather chair, slumped forward in a way that left no room for doubt. His skull had been fractured with a force that suggested either extreme rage or terrifying precision. Hamish stood in the center of the room, his hands shoved into his pockets to keep from touching anything. He didn't look like a bumbling village bobby now. He was a man who saw the world in patterns. He noted the way the blood had pooled on the floorboards, symmetrical, deliberate, and how the brass poker, polished and cold, rested just an inch beyond the victim's reach. "Did anyone touch him?" Hamish asked, his voice quiet, vibrating in the chill of the room. "No," Greg said, hovering in the doorway, his gaze averted. "I wouldn't go near him. I just ran." Hamish stepped closer, his boots silent on the floorboards. He noticed something that the driver had missed, a scrap of heavy, dark velvet caught on the corner of the writing desk. He leaned in, his eyes narrowing. It wasn't just any velvet. It was the same rich, expensive shade of midnight, blue as the jacket Thorn had been wearing the day before. Yet Thorn was currently dressed in a simple tweed sweater. Someone had been wearing Thorn's jacket, or someone had been trying to stage a scene involving it. Outside, the first distant, aggressive wail of a siren began to climb the mountain, a sound that grated against Hamish's nerves like sandpaper. It was the Strathbane police, and with them, the inevitable, loud-mouthed intrusion of DCI Blair. Hamish felt a familiar, creeping irritation. He didn't want the paperwork, he didn't want the investigation, and he certainly didn't want to spend his week babysitting an egomaniacal inspector who would undoubtedly arrest the first person he saw. Right, Hamish whispered to Lugs, who was sniffing the air with a look of profound, canine disappointment. The circus is coming to town. We've got maybe 10 minutes before the place is ruined by boots and shouting. Let's see what else the wind didn't tell us. He crouched by the fireplace, his eyes tracing the soot-stained bricks. There, buried in the ash, was a small, scorched piece of paper, a letter, or perhaps a portion of one. It was all that remained of whatever Thorn had been so desperate to hide. Hamish tucked it into his pocket, just as the first police cruiser broke through the fog, its lights strobing against the cottage walls in a harsh neon display of incompetence. His lazy, comfortable Tuesday had died with Julian Thorn, and he was already bracing for the headache that was about to arrive in the form of DCI Blair. Chapter 3. The Inspector's Rant. The arrival of the Strathbane police force was heralded by a cacophony of sirens that shattered the crisp, mournful silence of the glen and sent a flock of startled sheep scattering into the mist. Hamish Macbeth stood by the entrance to the cottage, his hands deep in his pockets, leaning against the cold stone wall with the practiced air of a man who had nowhere else to be, and certainly no desire to do anything. Two cruisers screeched to a halt on the wet gravel, spraying sludge against the ancient foundation of the cottage. DCI Blair emerged from the lead vehicle like a bull charging into an arena. He was a man of aggressive proportions, his face permanently flushed the color of a bruised plum, veins bulging in his neck as if he were perpetually on the verge of an apoplectic fit. Macbeth, Blair bellowed before his feet had even touched the ground. Stand aside. Clear the area. Get that flea, bitten mongrel away from the crime scene before I have him put down for interference. Lugs, having heard this exact sentiment on dozens of occasions, merely blinked and curled his tail tighter around his paws, offering the inspector a look of profound, canine indifference. Hamish offered a slow, vacuous grin. Morning, sir. Great day to drive from Strathbane, isn't it? The roads are a bit treacherous, but I'm sure you handled them fine. Don't give me your simpleton routine, you lazy, incompetent oaf. Blair stomped up to him, his spit landing on the lapel of Hamish's worn uniform. I've heard the report. A writer murdered in his own home. A high-profile case involving a statesman. And it's happened on your watch. My blood pressure is already through the roof, and I haven't even seen the body yet. Blair shoved past him, nearly knocking Hamish off balance. He marched into the cottage, his team of uniformed officers trailing behind him like nervous ducklings. Good God, Blair gasped, stopping dead in his tracks as he beheld the sight of the late Julian Thorn, slumped over his desk in the writing nook. He turned, his face darkening with a familiar, misplaced sense of authority. It's obvious. Look at this. The scene is a mess, a clear struggle. And who was the only person here, the driver? The young, impressionable employee who clearly felt slighted by his master? Or perhaps he found out about an inheritance he wasn't included in. But, sir, Hamish ventured, his voice purposefully grating and slow. Greg, the driver, he was the one who called the station. He's been in shock since. Doesn't seem like the sort to plan a murder, does he? And there's a bit of velvet on the desk that doesn't match the victim's clothes. Blair whips, his eyes narrowing to slits. I didn't ask for your opinion, Macbeth. I didn't ask for your expert analysis of clothing fabrics or amateur psychology. You have demonstrated, time and time again, that your primary contribution to this force is occupying space. Return to your station and file the paperwork for the forensics team. You are officially relieved of all investigative duties. Right you are, sir, Hamish said, tipping his cap with an exaggerated, servile motion. "Whatever you think is best, get out," Blair yelled, his face now a shade of crimson that suggested a medical emergency was imminent. "And take that dog with you." Hamish didn't need to be told twice. He whistled for lugs and began the slow trudge back toward the Land Rover. Behind him, he could hear Blair shouting orders, his voice echoing off the cottage walls, as he bullied the grieving driver and berated his own officers for not finding the obvious murder weapon immediately. As Hamish reached his vehicle, he paused, looking back at the dark, looming shape of Raven Hill Cottage. His laziness had served its purpose. By playing the fool, he had managed to get himself sidelined, which gave him the freedom he needed to actually find the truth. Blair would waste the next 24 hours badgering a terrified innocent man, while the real killer, someone who had clearly staged the room to look like a robbery gone wrong, would assume the investigation was effectively closed. It was a dangerous game, but one he knew well. He pulled a crumpled cigarette from his pocket, lit it, and inhaled deeply. The wind was picking up, swirling the dying leaves of autumn across the driveway. "He's chasing the wrong rabbit, lugs," Hamish whispered, his eyes narrowing as he watched the frantic activity around the cottage. "And the sooner he gets frustrated, the easier it'll be for us to slip in through the back door. Now, let's go find a warm kitchen and a sympathetic ear. I have a feeling the truth is hiding somewhere between the village gossip and the tea service." He climbed into the Land Rover, the engine turning over with a reluctant, rattling cough, and drove away, leaving behind the screaming DCI and the corpse in the writing nook, feeling less like a lazy policeman and more like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He had the scrap of paper in his pocket, a tiny, scorched piece of a larger, darker story, and he was ready to unravel it before the morning was out. Chapter 4. Whispers over tea. The village of Lochdabath was a place where information moved faster than the tide, yet it always arrived coated in a thick layer of local prejudice. By the time Hamish had driven his battered Land Rover back down the single-track road, the news of the Sassenach murder had already reached every hearth, oven, and bedside table. Hamish knew that official police questioning was a blunt instrument, a sledgehammer meant to crack a nut. His own method, by contrast, was the art of the mooch. It required patience, a bottomless capacity for tea, and the ability to listen to what people didn't say. He parked his vehicle behind the post office, where Mrs. McPhee was currently holding court. Mrs. McPhee, a woman whose girth was matched only by the reach of her ears, was the unofficial arbiter of truth in the village. If a secret existed in Lochdabath, Mrs. McPhee either knew it or had helped invent it. "Hamish Macbeth," she chirped, peering over her half-moon spectacles as he entered. "I suppose you've come for the mail, or perhaps you've come to tell us why the great DCI Blair is currently screaming at a pile of rocks up at Raven Hill." Hamish leaned against the counter, giving her his most vacant, weary smile. "Och, Mrs. McPhee. Blair doesn't talk to me much, says I'm a bit slow, and he's probably right. I've just been sent off to do the paperwork." A man gets awfully thirsty doing paperwork. Any chance of a cup of tea? Mrs. McPhee softened, as she always did for the poor, neglected local constable. She bustled into the back room, and moments later she returned with a chipped mug of tea and a plate of shortbread that was thick enough to break a tooth. "It's a tragedy, truly," she began, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "But you know, that Thorne man, he wasn't alone when he arrived. I saw him talking to a woman down by the pier 2 days ago. She was dressed in very fine clothes, the sort you don't see in Lochdabath, and they were having a fierce argument. She looked positively terrified, and he was looming over her like a thundercloud." Hamish munched on a piece of shortbread, his eyes dulling slightly, as if he was struggling to process the information. "Really? That's strange. Did you see which way she went?" "She drove off toward Inverness in a dark saloon," Mrs. McPhee noted, leaning in closer, the scent of lavender soap and old parchment clinging to her. "And then there's the matter of the local gossip. Old Angus, the shepherd, saw lights flickering in the cottage window after midnight. He thought it was ghosts, but Angus has had a fair bit of whiskey since his wife passed. Still, he swears he saw someone leaving the cottage on foot, walking toward the path that leads to the sea cliffs." Hamish thanked her, finished his tea with a gratified sigh, and wandered back out into the cool, biting air. He whistled for Lugs, who had been busy investigating a particularly interesting patch of moss near the bin. His next stop was the local curry shop, run by Mr. Patel. It was the only place in the village where one could get a meal that didn't involve boiled mutton, and Patel was always good for a chat. He found the man scrubbing the front window, his face set in a grim line. "Blair's men have been here, Hamish," Patel said without preamble. "They asked if I saw anyone suspicious near the cottage. I told them I saw no one, which is true. But I did see something." Hamish slumped into one of the plastic chairs, looking utterly disinterested. "Aye? Something interesting. The local minister, Mr. Graham," Patel said, glancing toward the door to ensure no one was listening. "He was seen leaving the cottage late last night. He looked pale, almost as if he were in shock. He's been trying to keep the cottage from being developed, citing the curse of the land. But he never actually goes near the place. Why would he be there at midnight?" Hamish tapped his fingers on the table. A woman in a fine car, a mysterious late-night visitor, and a minister obsessed with ancient superstitions. It was all starting to paint a picture, one that had nothing to do with a robbery and everything to do with something much colder, something involving secrets that were worth killing to keep quiet. He walked back to his Land Rover as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the valley. He had the pieces. Now, the official investigation was focused on a simple domestic tragedy. But Hamish knew the truth was far more complex. He didn't need DNA, he had gossip, he had observation, and he had the knowledge of who, in this village, would have the gall to commit such a crime. He turned the key, the engine roaring to life, and headed into the gathering gloom, ready to peel back the layers of a murder that had only just begun to show its teeth. He wasn't just a lazy policeman anymore. He was a man on the scent of something that would shake Lockduff to its very foundation. Chapter 5. A lady's frozen secret. The late afternoon light was fading into a bruised purple, casting long, mournful shadows across the manicured grounds of the village green, where Hamish Macbeth steered his Land Rover toward the gatehouse. His mind was turning over the fragments of information he had gathered like a man sorting through a handful of sea glass. He had the mysterious woman at the pier, the late-night visitor at the cottage, and the minister's sudden, unexplained presence at the scene. What he lacked was the connective tissue, the reason why a wealthy, arrogant outsider would find himself in a cold, isolated writing nook, with his life extinguished by a brass poker. As he pulled up near the lane that led toward the Halberton, Smythe estate, a sleek, silver Jaguar purred into view, coming to a halt just feet from his own battered vehicle. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped Priscilla Halberton Smythe. She looked as though she had been carved from marble, her regal posture and elegant wool coat providing a stark, almost painful contrast to the rugged, untamed beauty of the Highlands. Priscilla had been the bane and the delight of Hamish's life for years. She was everything he was not: wealthy, ambitious, and deeply concerned with social proprieties. Yet, in the quiet, unspoken language they shared, there was an understanding that transcended their different worlds. "Hamish," she said, her voice cool and crisp, cutting through the damp air, "I heard the news about Thorn. Please tell me you aren't doing something spectacularly foolish." Hamish climbed out of the Land Rover, shrugging his shoulders as if to emphasize the sag in his uniform. "Och, Priscilla, I'm just doing my job, or rather, I'm trying to avoid doing it, but DCI Blair is making that quite difficult. He's already decided the driver did it, and he's closing the file as we speak." Priscilla walked over to him, her eyes searching his face. She had long ago learned to look past the village idiot act. She saw the flickers of intelligence, the stillness in his posture, and the way his hands stayed steady even when he was describing a murder. "Blair is currently at the hotel, holding court," she whispered, stepping closer, so their conversation was lost to the wind. "He's convinced the driver had a grudge. It's an embarrassment, Hamish. The man is blinded by his own desire to close the file and get home in time for dinner. But I heard something at the club today. Julian Thorne wasn't just a writer. He was a disgraced venture capitalist. He had dozens of enemies. many of whom were heavily invested in his literary ventures. 1. A woman named Lady Vane was seen in the area yesterday. She's notorious for her ruthless approach to failed investments. Lady Vane. Hamish tapped his fingers on the Land Rover's roof. Mrs. McPhee mentioned a woman in a fine car. A woman who was arguing with him. If it was her, Priscilla noted, her gaze drifting toward the mountains, then this wasn't a robbery. It was a liquidation. Thorne owed millions to people who don't take kindly to loss. If he was about to publish a tell-all book about his former associates, he wouldn't have just been a liability. He would have been a walking death warrant. Hamish felt a cold prickle of realization at the back of his neck. The scrap of scorched paper in his pocket. The one he'd recovered from the hearth. It hadn't been a draft of a novel. It had been a list of names. A list of people Thorne had cheated. "You're thinking of someone who wanted silence," Hamish said, his voice uncharacteristically firm. "That makes sense. But Hamish, you have to be careful. If you cross Blair, he'll have your badge before you can explain your theory." "I don't care about the badge, Priscilla," Hamish replied, his voice dropping to a low, steady murmur. "I care about the truth. Blair is busy bullying a boy who couldn't even kill a spider, let alone a man like Thorne. If he makes an arrest, the real killer walks free. And that won't happen on my watch." Priscilla reached out, her gloved hand momentarily touching his arm, a rare fleeting moment of intimacy that made Hamish's heart skip a beat. "You're the only one who sees them, aren't you? The people the rest of the world overlooks. That is your strength, Hamish. Don't let your desire to be invisible cost you your integrity." She stepped back, her poise returning, as if she were afraid of showing too much concern. "I must go. My parents are expecting me for the evening. Just promise me one thing. Don't let him get away with it." "I promise," Hamish said, watching her return to her car. As she drove away, the roar of her engine fading into the vastness of the hills, Hamish felt a renewed sense of purpose. Priscilla had given him the final piece of the puzzle, a motive rooted in financial ruin, betrayal, and the cold, calculated necessity of removing a man who knew too much. He wasn't just a lazy policeman avoiding work anymore. He was a hunter. He watched the moon rise over the peaks, the silver light turning the landscape into a ghostly, monochromatic dream. The pieces were shifting. The picture was becoming clear. And for the first time that day, Hamish felt the thrill of the chase. He whistled for Lugs, his companion responding with a sharp, alert bark. The night was young, and the truth, for all its darkness, was waiting to be found in the shadows of Raven Hill. He climbed into his car, the engine turning over with a steady, comforting purr, and headed into the gathering darkness, ready to peel back the layers of a murder that had only just begun to show its teeth. Chapter 6. Stilettos in the Mud. The atmosphere inside the local holding cell. A repurposed, damp-walled storage room at the back of the Lochdubuff police station was stifling. DCI Blair was pacing the length of the narrow corridor, his face a mottled, angry red, his voice booming with the misplaced authority of a man who believed that volume was a substitute for intellect. He was in the middle of delivering a lecture on the absolute certainty of criminal psychology to a room full of bemused local constables who had long ago learned to tune out his booming, self-important voice. "It's not complicated, you idiots," Blair shouted, slamming a fist onto the wooden table. The driver, Greg, was seen near the cottage. He had the access, he had the keys, and he clearly cracked under the pressure of working for a volatile, temperamental man. "We have him in custody, and he's currently refusing to answer questions. This is closed by tonight." Hamish stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed over his chest, nursing a lukewarm cup of tea. He watched with a detached, quiet amusement as Blair continued his tirade. The DCI had managed to bully Greg into a state of catatonic shock, and the young man was now sitting on a hard wooden bench, staring blankly at the floor. "He hasn't confessed to anything, sir," one of the junior officers ventured, trying to sound helpful. "He's just been sitting there for 3 hours. "Which is just as good as a confession," Blair countered, his voice rising in irritation. "It's the guilt manifesting. My job is to recognize the signs of a perpetrator under stress, and I am the expert here." Hamish sighed, taking a slow, measured sip of his tea. He had spent the last 2 hours discreetly reviewing evidence against the physical realities of the crime. Earlier, while Blair was preoccupied with his dramatic interrogation, Hamish had slipped back into the cottage. He had examined the velvet scrap he'd found again. It wasn't just Thorne's jacket. It was from a bespoke, high-end tailor in London, the kind that catered to the aristocracy, and certainly not the sort of clothing that a humble driver would possess. Furthermore, he had taken a closer look at the writing nook. The floor was marked with a very specific, jagged pattern of heel prints, consistent, not with a man of the driver's slight build, but with a woman's expensive, stiletto-heeled boots. Hamish entered the room, his movements slow and deliberate. "Begging your pardon, sir," he drawled, his voice pitched to sound as unthreatening and dull as possible. "But I was just thinking, if Greg had killed him, he would have had to get the velvet on his hands. He's been wearing his uniform all day. Not a thread on it. It's almost as if he was never anywhere near the scene of the struggle. And those prints in the room? They looked like they were made by a very high-end lady's boot, size 6. Blair turned, his eyes burning. "I told you to keep out of this, Macbeth. Only your interference matches your incompetence. Get out of here before I have you suspended for obstruction of justice." "Right you are, sir," Hamish said, tipping his cap with an exaggerated, servile motion. "Whatever you think is best." Hamish retreated, his expression carefully blank. He had done his part. He had planted the seed of doubt, even if Blair was too stubborn to acknowledge it. He walked out of the station and into the cool, biting air of the evening. Lugs were waiting for him, his tail thumping a steady rhythm against the gravel. Hamish looked at the dog and offered a grim smile. "He's so convinced he's right, Lugs, that he's blinded himself to the truth. He's going to hold that poor boy until he's blue in the face. And meanwhile, the real killer is sitting somewhere, feeling safe because the police have pinned the tail on the donkey." Hamish turned toward the village. He knew where he had to go next. The killer hadn't just left behind footprints. They had left behind a pattern of behavior that was as clear as a fingerprint. It wasn't about a disgruntled employee. It was about the cold, calculated liquidation of a man who knew too much. And he, Hamish Macbeth, was the only person in Lockduff who wasn't looking at the obvious. He was looking at the shadows, and in those shadows, the truth was beginning to take a very distinct and very dangerous shape. He adjusted his cap, feeling the weight of the investigation shift from a nuisance to a necessity. The game was far from over, and he had a feeling that the lady in the expensive boots was going to find that the Highlands held secrets far older and colder than she could ever imagine. Chapter 7. The minister's penance, the night air in Lockduff, had turned razor-sharp, the kind of cold that seemed to seep through wool and skin to settle directly in the marrow. Hamish walked away from the station, his hands deep in his pockets, and his shoulders hunched against the wind. He wasn't heading toward his cottage. Instead, he took the long, winding path that led up toward the servants' quarters and the old, disused storage rooms behind Raven Hill Cottage. He was thinking about the heel prints again. It was a detail so mundane that a man like DCI Blair would naturally disregard it, preferring the emotional narrative of a dramatic crime of passion. But to Hamish, who spent his days observing poachers' habits and subtle shifts in the behavior of the local wildlife, a footprint was a signature. It told a story of height, weight, and, most importantly, gait. The stiletto prints indicated a woman of stature, someone accustomed to moving with a deliberate, aggressive confidence, the exact opposite of the stumbling, panicked movements the killer had tried to emulate when staging the crime scene. As he reached the shadow of the cottage's east wing, he stopped. He pulled out a small, bent flashlight, clicked it on, and shone it toward the ground near the service entrance. There, in the frost-hardened mud, were the clear impressions of a heavy professional-grade boot, overlaid by the fainter, elegant marks of a designer heel. The killer hadn't just been a lady in stilettos. They had been assisted, or perhaps they had changed their footwear entirely once the job was finished. He thought back to his earlier conversation with Priscilla and the rumors of Thorne's venture capitalist enemies, the people whose money had evaporated because of his reckless, fraudulent schemes. Lady Vane, the ruthless investor, wasn't just a disgruntled shareholder. She was a woman whose entire reputation had been built on the cold-blooded removal of anyone who threatened her financial empire. Thorne hadn't just been a writer. He was a man who held the evidence of her illegal shell companies, and he had come to the Highlands to use that information to blackmail his way back into a life of luxury. A sudden movement in the darkness caught his eye. A tall, gaunt figure emerged from the side door of the cottage, walking with a measured, purposeful gait. Hamish extinguished his light and pressed himself into the deep shadows of an ancient stone archway. He watched as the figure moved toward the garden, their silhouette sharp against the moonlight. It wasn't a stranger. It was the minister, Mr. Graham, the man Patel had seen leaving the scene the night before. But as Hamish watched, he realized the man wasn't alone. Lady Vane, the woman from the pier, emerged from the shadows to meet him, her face a pale, strained oval. They weren't just conspirators, they were an unlikely, desperate pair, bound by a mutual, crushing need to silence Thorne before the truth of his blackmail came to light. The minister hadn't been there for a curse. He had been there for the soul of the church's endowment fund, which Thorne had foolishly embezzled months prior. Hamish waited, his heart thumping a slow, steady rhythm in his chest. He didn't move. He simply watched, his mind cataloguing the facts. The minister's desperation, Lady Vane's cold calculation, and the intimate knowledge of the cottage's layout that only an insider would possess. The motive wasn't just greed. It was the desperate, frantic preservation of status. The minister was protecting his flock from the scandal of his own financial incompetence, and Vane was protecting her empire from the taint of Thorne's evidence. They had turned the cottage into a graveyard to keep their own reputations pristine. It wasn't a crime of passion for the driver, was it? Hamish whispered to himself, the cold air turning his breath into a ghostly plume of vapor. It was a corporate and ecclesiastical execution. He stood perfectly still, letting the realization settle over him. The lazy policeman was gone. In his place was a man who understood the weight of secrets living in the dark corners of the world. He realized now why the victim had been so frightened. He hadn't been scared of his driver. He had seen the minister and Vane, the two pillars of society he had most systematically betrayed, and he had known that the game was up. The motive was personal, petty, and profoundly human. The kind of motive that the textbooks Blair relied on would never adequately describe. It was the crushing weight of a grudge, refined over time until it became an inevitable act of violence. Hamish stepped out from the shadows, his presence signaled only by the soft crunch of gravel beneath his heavy, worn boots. He didn't rush, he didn't call for backup. He simply waited for the pair to turn, his face a calm, unreadable mask. The velvet was a bit of a theatrical touch. "Don't you think, my lady?" Hamish said, his voice quiet, but carrying clearly through the stillness of the night. The pair stopped, their shoulders stiffening as they turned to face the constable. Their faces, caught in the pale wash of the moonlight, were etched with a lifetime of hard-won influence and suppressed boiling resentment. They didn't look like murderers. They looked like people who had finally, after years of waiting, laid down a burden that had become too heavy to carry. "He deserved it," Graham said, his voice raw, devoid of surprise or fear. "Maybe he did," Hamish replied, his expression softening with an empathy that was as genuine as it was dangerous. "But that doesn't change the fact that you're the one who has to live with the ghosts now." The silence between them was thick, filled with the weight of years, the cold wind, and the inevitable, crushing reality of the law. Hamish took one step forward, his hand resting on the holster of his service pistol. Though he made no move to draw it, he knew exactly what he had to do next. And for the first time in his career, he felt the heavy, lingering sadness of a truth that wouldn't bring anyone peace. He was the only one who could see the rot beneath the surface. Tonight, he would be the one to rip it out, regardless of how much it cost him. Chapter 8. The bait of broken promises. The night air had descended into a brittle, biting frost, turning the valley into a landscape of silver-tipped shadows and stark, unforgiving silhouettes. Hamish stood at the edge of the cottage grounds, his mind operating with the cool, calculated precision of a chess master. He had the scrap of scorched paper tucked securely into his tunic, and he had the knowledge that the minister and Lady Vane were desperate, a dangerous combination that he intended to exploit with the single-minded focus of a predator. He knew that if he approached Blair with his theories, he would be laughed out of the station. He also knew that if he waited, the pair might manage to destroy the remaining evidence, linking them to the crime. He needed to force their hand. He needed to bring the minister and the lady into the open, to a place where they would be forced to reveal their connection to the murder of Julian Thorne. Hamish pulled his radio from his belt and tuned it to a frequency he knew Blair's team monitored. He wasn't going to report a crime. He was going to leak a rumor, a whisper of discovered evidence that was too tempting for the guilty to ignore. "Dispatch, this is PC Macbeth," he said, his voice crackling with a practiced, nervous urgency. I found something up here near the old cliffs. A package. It looks like it might contain documents. I'm going to stay here and guard it until someone can get out here. Do not alert the DCI yet. I need to make sure it's what I think it is before I cause a stir. He knew the radio protocol in the village was loose. He knew that Lady Vane, who had been keeping a close watch on the police, would be monitoring their communications. He also knew their collective ego was as inflated as their reputations. If they believed the original list, the very thing that could ruin them, was sitting unguarded in the hands of a simpleton, they would be unable to resist coming to retrieve it themselves. Hamish moved into the shadows of the crag, finding a natural hollow that overlooked the trail leading back to the cottage's rear entrance. He whistled low, and Lugs trotted out of the darkness, settling beside him with a silent, watchful stillness. The dog knew he felt the tension in Hamish's muscles, the razor-sharp focus that had replaced the usual lazy drift of his manner. Time crawled by, marked only by the slow, rhythmic sweep of the moonlight across the valley floor. Hamish waited, his eyes fixed on the path. He didn't have to wait long. Within an hour, a dark, unmarked saloon car pulled onto the dirt track near the cottage. Its headlights doused. Two figures stepped out: Lady Vane and the minister, Mr. Graham. They moved with a hurried, aggressive grace, their faces obscured by the collar of their coats. Hamish watched them, his heart a steady, thumping rhythm. They were here, just as he had anticipated. They reached the base of the crag, looking around with a frantic, predator-like intensity. Lady Vane was muttering, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "If that fool found the list, we're finished," she hissed. "We have to find it, burn it, and then deal with the constable. If the police get hold of it, the entire foundation of our reputation is dead in the water. He's a simpleton." The minister replied, his voice cold and devoid of empathy. "He probably doesn't even know what he's holding. Let's just grab the package and leave." They began to climb the path toward the crag, their movements clumsy and hurried. This was the moment. Hamish stood up, his posture shifting, the slumped, weary mask falling away to reveal a man who was, in that moment, the most dangerous person in the glen. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't shout. He simply stepped out of the shadows, blocking their path, his silhouette large and imposing against the pale light of the moon. "Evening," Hamish said, his voice resonant and calm. "You seem to be looking for something. Would this be it?" He held up a small, empty envelope he had prepared earlier, letting them see it in the dim light. Lady Vane and the minister froze, their faces turning toward him with a look of pure, unadulterated shock. They had underestimated the stupid policeman for the last time. "You," Lady Vane breathed, her hand disappearing into her coat. "You have no idea what you've started. You pathetic little man." "I think I do," Hamish replied, his voice hardening, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her falter. "I know about Thorne, and I know why you had to silence him." The confrontation had begun, and for the first time, Hamish had the advantage. He had set the trap, baited it with the one thing they couldn't resist, and now, in the cold, unforgiving silence of the mountains, the truth was going to be demanded. He waited, his muscles coiled, ready to fight for the justice that had been stolen, knowing that this night would end not with the quiet, lazy rhythm of his usual life, but with a reckoning that would echo through the entire valley. He stood, his dog at his side, ready to demand the truth, knowing that the trap had finally snapped shut on the two people who had thought themselves above the law. Chapter 9. Reckoning on the crag, the silence on the mountainside was absolute, a heavy, suffocating pressure that seemed to vibrate with the collision of two very different worlds. Lady Vane stood frozen on the narrow path, her hands still buried inside her coat, her face a mask of predatory shock. Mr. Graham, however, was already recovering, his eyes darting toward the steep drop-off to their right, his mind clearly calculating the odds of a desperate escape. "You really should take your hand out of your coat, my lady," Hamish said, his voice quiet and steady, carrying a note of iron that had never once been displayed in the village station. "The ground is treacherous enough as it is. I'd hate for you to trip and fall while carrying something that might go off." Lady Vane pulled her hand out, empty, her face pale beneath the moonlight. "You're making a grave mistake, Constable. You have no idea of the power you're playing with. This is a legacy issue, a reputation. People have invested heavily in our influence. You're just a local policeman in a crumbling station. Nobody will care what happens to you out here, in the dark." "I expect that's true," Hamish replied, taking a slow, measured step forward. Lugs moved with him, the dog's hackles raised, his low growl serving as a warning that was impossible to misinterpret. "But you see, that's the beauty of living in Lockdove. We don't care much for your money, and we care even less for your social circles. What we care about is the truth." "Why did you kill Julian Thorne?" The minister laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that did nothing to hide the panic behind his eyes. "He was a thief. He was a charlatan. He was going to destroy everything we built, everything the church and the estate stood for. He deserved to be stopped. We were just the instruments of fate." Hamish didn't blink. He felt the cold air biting at his face, but he was burning with a quiet, focused rage. "Fate doesn't use a brass poker, Mr. Graham. That was you and your greed. You were protecting your own comfortable lives, and you were willing to sacrifice a man to keep your secrets buried." Without warning, the minister lunged. It was a clumsy, desperate motion, born of panic and a sudden, violent realization that he was losing control. He swung a heavy, ornate walking cane toward Hamish's head. Hamish, who had spent his life appearing slow and reactive, moved with the sudden, startling speed of a mountain cat. He sidestepped the blow, caught the minister's wrist in a grip that left no room for movement, and swept the man's legs out from under him. Mr. Graham hit the frozen ground with a grunt of pain and shock, his pristine black coat ruined by the mud. Before Lady Vane could react, Hamish had pivoted, closing the distance between them and pinning her against the rock face with a hand as steady as stone. "Call the station," Hamish commanded, his voice cold. "Tell them you're ready to talk. Tell them that if you don't surrender, I will present the list I have to the press by sunrise. Every name, every offshore account, every dollar you stole. You'll never get away with this." Lady Vane hissed, struggling against his grip, her eyes blazing with an impotent, aristocratic fury. "I'm not trying to get away with anything," Hamish retorted. "I'm just doing my job, and in Lockduff, work is keeping the peace. Right now, you are the furthest thing from peaceful I've seen in a long, long time." He reached into her coat, retrieving her mobile phone, and handed it to her with a look of icy indifference. "Call them, now." As she shakily dialed the number, Hamish kept a watchful eye on the minister, who was struggling to pull himself up from the mud, his face a grotesque mask of confusion and bruised pride. The entire scene was a far cry from the lazy, uneventful life Hamish had spent years cultivating. But as he stood there in the dark, he felt a strange, jarring sense of clarity. He wasn't the useless peasant Blair thought him to be, and he wasn't the simpleton the pair had tried to bully. He was the guardian of the glen, and he had proven, in the messiest, most effective way possible, that he would defend his own with a ferocity that no city-bred outsider could ever comprehend. The minister spoke into the phone, his voice tight and hurried, relaying the instructions with a clarity that left no room for debate. Hamish listened, his ears pointed, confirming Strathbane police were on their way. He gave a single, sharp nod, his hands still tight on her arm. The trap had closed perfectly. He had the conspirators, he had the motive, and he had the upper hand. The night had turned from a quiet walk in the mountains into a decisive, brutal reclamation of justice. And as the sirens began to wail in the distance, the sound of Blair finally catching up, albeit far too late, Hamish knew that the truth would finally be told. He stood firm, his dog at his side, ready to hand the credit over to the DCI the moment the man arrived, perfectly content to slip back into the shadows once the work was done. He had won the day, and for the man who loved the quiet of the hills, that was more than enough. Chapter 10. The Pride of Strathbane. The morning after the arrest. The sun rose over Lochduff with a stubborn, cheerful brightness that seemed entirely inappropriate for the grim events of the previous night. Hamish Macbeth sat in his small, cluttered office, staring at a blank piece of paper that was meant to be his official report. Outside, the village was slowly beginning to stir. He could hear the distant clatter of milk crates and the muffled sound of Mr. Patel opening his shop. It was a normal morning, yet the air felt strangely heavy, as if the village itself were holding its breath, waiting for the echo of the night's violence to dissipate. The door to his station opened without knocking. DCI Blair marched in, his chest puffed out like a bantam rooster, his face still flushed, though now with a glow of self-satisfaction rather than rage. He was clutching a thick file folder, his knuckles white with the force of his grip. Behind him trailed the reporters who had descended on the village at dawn, their cameras clicking and flashes popping in the confined, dusty space of the police station. "Macbeth," Blair barked, his voice filling the cramped space and making the radio on the desk rattle. "I've just come from the press conference. I've laid out the entire case. The arrest of the mastermind, Lady Vane, and the apprehension of the local accomplice, the minister. I've ensured the press knows that Strathbane took total control the moment the situation escalated. My tactical maneuvering on the mountainside was the decisive factor that broke their resolve." Hamish didn't look up from his desk. He continued to fiddle with his pen, his expression carefully blank. His posture slumped in a way that suggested he was barely conscious. "Aye, sir. I'm sure you did a grand job. The media must be thrilled to have such a clear-cut case to report. It's not every day a DCI gets to capture a lady and a minister in one go." Blair leaned over the desk, his eyes narrowing. He had spent the last hour convincing himself that the previous night's chaos was entirely the result of his own brilliant intuition and decisive leadership. "I didn't mention your little patrol on the crag, Macbeth. It was, frankly, an amateurish display of physical bravado that nearly compromised the investigation. I've filed the official report as a Strathbane-led operation. I've cited my own strategic oversight in the tactical apprehension of the suspects and the containment of the scene." Hamish leaned back, letting his jaw slacken just enough to look vacant. "That's the right kind of you, sir. I'm just a local constable. I don't really know much about strategy or tactics. I'm just happy the village is quiet again, and that the truth finally came out, however it happened to get there." Blair's expression softened, a flicker of genuine relief crossing his features. He had been terrified that Hamish might try to claim credit, that the village idiot might actually reveal he had orchestrated the entire scenario to force Blair's hand. The fact that Hamish was so willing to retreat into the shadows only confirmed Blair's narrow-minded view of his subordinate. "You're a useful man to have around when you keep your head down, Macbeth," Blair said, his tone bordering on patronizing. "I've decided not to pursue a disciplinary inquiry regarding your unorthodox behavior on the mountainside. Consider it a learning experience. You've had your moment of excitement. Now go back to doing whatever it is you do to fill your time." "Thank you, sir," Hamish said, his voice slow and heavy with feigned gratitude. "I'll get right back to the paperwork. I'm sure it'll take me all day." Blair huffed, straightened his tie, and marched back out toward the press, eager to bask in the flashbulbs. Hamish watched him through the window as he posed for a photo in front of the police station, the DCI beaming with pride. Hamish felt a deep, profound sense of relief. The transfer he had dreaded, the promotion that would have dragged him away to a city desk, it was all gone. Blair would go back to Strathbane, regaling his peers with tales of his own investigative genius. And Hamish would remain here, in the quiet, damp solitude of Lochduff. The truth of the murder, the messy, human reality of the greed-driven conspiracy, would be buried in a file that no one would ever bother to read. It was a small, quiet victory, But in his own way, it was exactly the kind of justice Hamish preferred. He stood up, stretched his lanky frame, and approached the stove. The kettle was whistling, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the lingering gloom of the office. He poured a cup of coffee, the steam curling into the cool air, and took a long, slow sip. The taste was bitter, strong, and entirely satisfying. He looked over at Lugs, who was curled up on his rug, one eye open and watching him with patient, canine wisdom. "We did it, Lugs," Hamish whispered, a small, tired smile touching the corners of his mouth. "He thinks he's the hero, and we get to stay in the Highlands. A fair trade, I'd say." He walked to the window and looked out toward the mountains. The clouds were beginning to break, revealing patches of deep, brilliant blue. The village was returning to its natural rhythm, the pulse of daily life resuming its slow, steady rhythm. The threat of the cottage development was a shadow that had passed, leaving behind nothing but a lesson that no one would learn and a story that no one would ever fully understand. He didn't need the recognition. He didn't need the medal or the promotion. He had his freedom, his mountains, and the quiet, secret knowledge of a man who knew exactly how the world worked. He finished his coffee, set the mug down, and walked toward the door, ready to face the day. The case was closed, the records were settled, and as far as the rest of the world was concerned, the most dangerous thing that had happened in Lockduff was a case of a writer who moved too fast. He stepped out into the crisp, morning air, feeling lighter than he had in weeks, prepared to sink back into his routine, perfectly happy to be the invisible man in the most beautiful place on earth. Chapter 11. Shadows over the loch. The week that followed the arrest of Lady Vane and the minister was one of those rare transcendent periods in Lockduff, where the weather seemed to apologize for its previous harshness. The wind had died down to a gentle whisper, and the clouds parted to reveal a sky so blue it looked like an artist had painted it with a single, unhesitating stroke. The mountains, usually looming and foreboding, were bathed in a soft, golden light that made them look almost welcoming. It was the sort of Highland weather that made a man wonder why anyone would ever want to live anywhere else. Hamish Macbeth was back in his natural habitat, the absolute, blissful vacuum of doing nothing. He was sitting on the edge of the old stone pier, his legs dangling over the water, his fishing rod lying forgotten on the mossy wood beside him. Lugs were stretched out in the sun, his ears twitching occasionally at the sound of the gulls. There were no missing writers to find, no vengeful aristocrats to outwit, and most importantly, no DCI Blair shouting into a radio. The village had largely moved on. The investigators had packed up their forensic kits and vanished, leaving behind nothing but a few deep ruts in the earth and the lingering memory of the drama. Raven Hill Cottage remained, silent and undisturbed, a testament to the fact that some things in the Highlands were simply not meant to be changed. Life in Lockduff was like a calm pool. You could throw a rock into it, and for a few moments, the ripples would spread and disturb the surface. But soon enough, the water would settle, and everything would be as it had been before. Hamish took a slow sip of the coffee he had brought from the hotel. It was rich, hot, and tasted infinitely better than the thin, watery liquid he usually brewed on his own stove. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the sun soak into his bones. He felt a profound sense of satisfaction. He had survived another brush with ambition, another attempt by the outside world to drag him into its messy, complicated machinery, and he had come out the other side entirely unscathed. He thought about the case, fleetingly. He thought about the minister and the lady, now likely sitting in cold, grey cells far from the Highland light, their carefully constructed reputations shattered by the very truth they had killed to bury. There was no joy in the thought, only a quiet, melancholy acceptance. The world was full of people like them, people who carried their greed like a weapon, waiting for the day they could carve a piece of the world into their own image. Hamish knew he couldn't stop them all, and he certainly couldn't force the world to be a place where justice was always clean and simple. All he could do was watch, listen, and occasionally, when the need was dire, nudge the scales just enough to keep the chaos from consuming the village he loved. A soft, familiar footstep sounded on the wooden planks behind him. Hamish didn't turn, he didn't need to. He knew the crisp, rhythmic tap of her heels, the light, expensive fragrance of her perfume. that always seemed to cut through the smell of salt and fish. "I thought I might find you here," Priscilla said, her voice soft. "Aye," Hamish replied, still looking at the water. "It's a good day for contemplating the scenery, or, more accurately, not contemplating anything at all." Priscilla sat on the pier a few feet away from him, her posture perfect, her coat immaculate. She looked at the lock, her expression unreadable. "The village is talking, you know. They say the writer was just a man who didn't understand the geography of the Highlands. They say the murder was a terrible, tragic misunderstanding of local property rights. They usually get the story wrong in the end," Hamish said, picking up his rod and giving it a half-hearted tug. "Even if the details are all wrong." Priscilla turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face. "You did well, Hamish, not just with the resolution, but with how you handled it. Blair is still telling everyone he cracked the case, and you're still the lazy local copper. You gave up fame for your own peace of mind. Not many men would do that." "I'm not a man of glory, Priscilla," Hamish said with a wry, tired smile. "I'm a man of habit. Glory is far too exhausting. It requires too much maintenance." Priscilla laughed, a rare, genuine sound that made the air feel suddenly, inexplicably lighter. "I suppose you're right. You're a terrible, infuriating, impossible man, Hamish Macbeth." "Aye," he agreed, watching a small silver fish jump in the distance. "But I'm a local, and that's what counts." She stood up after a few moments, brushing off her coat. "I'm leaving for London tomorrow. My parents think the Highlands are a bit much after the events of the last few days." "They are a bit much," Hamish conceded. "They aren't for everyone." "I'll miss it," she said. And for a fleeting second, the armor of her social standing dropped, revealing a loneliness that mirrored his own. "I'll miss the quiet. The quiet will be here when you come back," he said, turning to look at her. She offered him a small, sad smile, then turned and walked back toward the village, her silhouette becoming smaller and smaller against the bright, open landscape. Hamish watched her go, then turned his gaze back to the water. He was alone again, but it wasn't a lonely kind of solitude. It was the solitude of a man who belonged to the land, who felt the pulse of the hills in his own heartbeat. He stood up, whistled for lugs, and began the slow, easy walk back to his cottage. The evening shadows were beginning to lengthen, the world turning into a soft, golden blur of peace. He had his pot of stew waiting on the stove, a warm bed, and a life that was exactly as he wanted it to be. He was home, and for Hamish Macbeth, that was the only truth that ever really mattered.